Since we adopted the Constitution in 1787 and had our first presidential election in 1788, we have had a total of 45 presidents. Almost all of these presidents had a great many accomplishments while in office. But what this video is about is what these men did with their free time and their post-presidency. 8 of these 45 presidents unfortunately did not have a post-presidency because of death while in office. These 8 are William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Abe Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, Warren Harding, FDR, and most recently, JFK. As such, they will not be included in this video. Now, starting with our first president, let's break down every president's post-presidency. On March 4th, 1797, George Washington stepped down from office after serving his full 2 terms, and John Adams took that office. This may not have been a remarkable thing if Washington had not been our first ever president, that he decided to step down and return home after just 2 terms, when he could have been president practically as long as he'd like, and when some were still trying to nominate him for yet another 3rd term, was a remarkable thing. This decision, like all other decisions presidents make, set a precedent for all future presidents. None except for FDR would serve more than 2 terms. Washington returned to his Mount Vernon home just 11 days after his resignation. However, his rest would be brief. Just as Adams became president, war loomed on the horizon. Many thought that France and the U.S. would go to war, and they nearly did, though Adams put the idea of war down by negotiating with France. However, before this resolution, Adams appointed Washington as lieutenant general, the 2nd highest ranking official in the army, other, at the time, than the President of the United States themselves. When the conflict passed, Washington resigned the lieutenant general position and went back to Mount Vernon. In 1799, Washington redrafted his will in a surprising way, asking that after both he and his wife died, that his slaves would be freed. This was an act of regret, if only half-hearted regret. He knew slavery was a moral evil, and he hoped that the freeing of his slaves would inspire other slaveholders to do the same. But it didn't. Washington died on December 14, 1799, just 3 years after leaving office. John Adams was our first single-term president, and though he was renominated by the Federalists for the presidency, which was one of the largest political parties of the day, he never really came close to re-election. Almost immediately after returning to his Quincy home in Massachusetts, John Adams began writing. These writings included his autobiography, numbers of public writings on almost every political issue of the times, and personal letters. In 1812, after Thomas Jefferson had already left the presidency, Adams started writing to him again. The two had been good friends, but over their long public careers they became distant, and even came to know each other as enemies. However, once they started writing again, they became good friends once again. According to the article from the Miller Center on Adams' post-presidency, they, quote, exchanged hundreds of letters on every conceivable topic, unquote. Coincidentally, the 2 men both died on the very same day in 1826. Also by coincidence, the date of their deaths happened to be the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson, the father of the Declaration of Independence, returned to his Monticello home in early 1809 after his friend James Madison took office. Jefferson was, before anything else, a scientist. That was his passion. Needless to say, in retirement, this is what Jefferson spent most of his time doing. He also continued in his position as president of the American Philosophical Society. However, the thing that he was most proud of in his post-presidency was the University of Virginia. Jefferson, according to the university's own Miller Center, designed every single on-campus building, the school's curriculum, and helped choose its original staff. Jefferson was on the brink of bankruptcy for the great deal of his post-presidential years, and if not for the generosity of others, he would have lost Monticello. Jefferson, unlike Washington, refused to free his slaves. This is partly because he couldn't, but given Jefferson's nature and general lack of any actual empathy for the enslaved, I doubt he would have, even if he could have. As described in Adams' post-presidency section of this video, the two presidents died on the very same day. After James Madison stepped down from the presidency after serving out his full 2 terms, he, like Jefferson and Washington before him, returned to his Virginia plantation. After Jefferson resigned his position as head of the University of Virginia, Madison took over. In 1829, Madison served in the Virginia Constitutional Convention, which, according to Wikipedia, was primarily concerned with voting rights and representation in the General Assembly, which was and is the legislative branch in the state government of Virginia. While in the Constitutional Convention, Madison continued to make compromises between slaveholders and other anti-slavery members. Madison was also a big advocate for the gradual abolition and resettlement of slaves and free blacks in Africa, which was called colonization. Madison was actually one of the founders of the American Colonization Society, which, as the name suggests, supported such a plan of colonization. This was, of course, a backwards and wrong plan, but at the time, and especially from someone like Madison, who owned many slaves himself, it was a very progressive view to have. In fact, even Abraham Lincoln, who became president over 50 years after Madison, campaigned on a pro-colonization platform in 1860. Madison died in late June of 1836, leaving over 100 unfreed slaves to his wife Dolly. James Monroe left office on March 4, 1825. However, he stayed in the White House for a few weeks longer. Monroe's wife, Elizabeth, was very sick and she couldn't travel for some time. However, she eventually recovered enough to make it back to their Oak Hill home. Monroe, like Madison and Jefferson, served on the college board at the University of Virginia for nearly the rest of his life. Monroe also served in the Virginia Constitutional Convention. However, he was actually elected president of the convention, unlike Madison. Monroe was absolutely heartbroken when his wife died in 1830. Afterwards, he moved in with his son-in-law and his daughter in New York City. He actually tried writing a book about the U.S. government as well as many other governments in the modern and ancient world. Unfortunately, Monroe never finished this book, knowing that he couldn't finish it before he, died. Monroe instead started writing his autobiography. However, he never finished that either, but that wasn't for lack of effort. He wrote over 300 pages about his life up to the year 1805. He unfortunately died before he could finish this work. Monroe passed away on the 4th of July, 1831. He was the third and last president to have died on Independence Day. Monroe, like Madison and Jefferson, left many unfreed slaves behind him when he died. Quincy Adams was one of the first presidents, and one of the only, to go on to be elected to national public office after their presidency. Just 2 years after losing re-election, Adams decided to run for the U.S. Congress for Massachusetts in 1830. Adams was easily elected and so began a 9-term congressional career, lasting from his inauguration in 1831 to his death in 1848. While a congressman, Adams was one of the most vocal anti-slavery voices in all of the Senate. Adams was also one of the men who got rid of the gag rule, which banned any talk of slavery on the House floor. On February 21st of 1848, just after he cast a loud vote in opposition to a motion to decorate certain Army officials serving in the Mexican-American War. Adams suffered a stroke, and just a couple of days later he fell into a coma and never woke up. Jackson retired from the presidency on March 4, 1833, when his vice president, Martin Van Buren, took up office as president. Jackson seemed to hate politics all of his time while in office, but once he left that office, he seemed to miss politics. Jackson would advise Van Buren and help him in any and every way while he was in office. Once Van Buren failed at re-election, Jackson became even more politically active. He advocated for the annexation of Texas, and in 1844 even came to influence the Democratic Party primary, and help James Polk, the only major candidate to be pro-annexation, become the nominee over Van Buren. Jackson died on June 8, 1845, of heart failure. Martin Van Buren was defeated by William Henry Harrison in his bid for re-election. But Van Buren knew that he would be heading back to the White House soon. He was wrong, but it didn't mean he wasn't going to try. In 1844, Van Buren tried to get the Democratic nomination for president, but having already lost an election, the Democratic Party knew Van Buren was a weak candidate. On top of that, Jackson, like I already said, chose to back James Polk for the presidency instead of Van Buren. This was basically the nail in Van Buren's political coffin. However, once Polk was elected, he offered Van Buren the ministership to London, but Van Buren turned down the offer and kept bitter over the 1844 Democratic primary. In 1848, Van Buren ran with the Free Soil Party, a party he helped found, which was basically an anti-expansion or anti-manifest destiny party. Van Buren and this new party had practically no chance of winning, and they didn't. But when the party collapsed in 1854, the Free Soil Party integrated with the Republican Party, which is funny because Van Buren was a Democrat and was vice president under Jackson, the founder of the Democratic Party. But even with his Democratic history, Van Buren would support Lincoln in his anti-secession platform in 1860. Van Buren traveled all over the world after his second re-election loss in 1848, and he also wrote his autobiography. Van Buren died on July 24, 1862, after fighting off pneumonia for weeks, a bronchial asthma, and heart failure. John Tyler was the first vice president to become president after the death or otherwise disability of the president they served under. William Henry Harrison, who was John Tyler's president in this case, had a very short presidency. After Harrison rode his horse to his own inauguration, which was on a very rainy and cold day without a coat, and then proceeded to give the single longest inaugural address up to this day, he laid sick for a month. Harrison, who was the oldest president elected up to that point, got pneumonia and died just a month after his inauguration. So besides being the first president to become president in this way, who we'll call accidental presidents from now on, he also served out the longest portion of a former president's term. Also while in office, Tyler realigned himself with the third party and tried to get re-elected, though he ultimately failed in that. Anyhow, after serving out the rest of Harrison's term, Tyler resigned the office and returned to his plantation in Virginia, where he had about 29 slaves. These years, from 1845 to 1860, were pretty quiet. That is, until the Civil War began. At first, Tyler was moderate, trying to host a peace conference between Northern Unionist voices and Southern Secessionist voices. Nothing came of this conference, though, and Tyler quickly gave up his attempts at moderation. Instead, he defected to the Confederacy. He was the only president to have done so, and he was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives, but died before his term could start. When he was buried with the Confederate flag draped over his coffin. When James Polk was running for his first term, he made a promise that he would only serve one term. and he kept that promise even though re-election would have been incredibly easy for him. Polk returned to his home in Nashville, Tennessee, and died just 3 months thereafter. Polk's post-presidency is the shortest of all former presidents. Fillmore was the second of the so-called accidental presidents who, like John Tyler, only became president because of the president they served under died. While attending the swearing-in of Franklin Pierce, who succeeded Fillmore as president, Fillmore's wife caught pneumonia and died soon after. A few months later, his daughter, Anna, caught cholera and also died. This wasn't an easy time for Fillmore, but, as Michael Holt from the Miller Center said, he took solace in politics. In 1856, the Know Nothing Party decided to write Fillmore in as their candidate for president. Fillmore wasn't actually a Know Nothing Party member in the first place, and he wasn't even told he was going to be nominated. But in spite of this, Fillmore didn't want to see the Republican candidate, John Fremont, elected. So he would campaign if only for the sole purpose of preventing Fremont's election. Fillmore lost, but in doing this also prevented Fremont from becoming the first Republican president, which was really the whole point anyhow. After this, Fillmore retired from politics altogether and returned to his home in Buffalo, New York. He then remarried just 4 years after he lost his other wife, but this time to a wealthy Albany widow. When the Civil War came around, Fillmore helped to enlist as many men as he could in the Union Army and did most everything he could do to help the Union. In spite of his pro-Union feelings, Fillmore was very much not progressive on the issue of slavery. He was the president who refused to stand up to the fugitive slave law, which allowed slave catchers to go across state lines to non-slave free states, and practically kidnap free African Americans and haul them to slavery in the South. It was because of this that, after Lincoln's tragic assassination, that Fillmore's home was vandalized with black paint. Fillmore died of a stroke in the winter of 1874, still a leading member in his local Buffalo community. Pierce retired from the presidency in March of 1857 and went to his New Hampshire home. From the time of his resignation up to the Civil War, he lived a quiet life. Once war broke out, though, he supported the Union. But he hated Lincoln, at least politically, and he criticized Lincoln all throughout the war. He even said Lincoln was the cause of the Civil War as a whole. When Lincoln was killed, Pierce's home, like Fillmore's, was surrounded by a mob of angry, grieving people. When Pierce stood on his balcony and gave a short speech basically telling the crowd to go home, they did. Pierce died in 1869. James Buchanan basically got all of the blame for the Civil War. Many say he was just too weak to stand up to the Confederacy and rebellion. This wasn't altogether wrong either. A regret, or some sort of other feeling of shame, made Buchanan just leave politics and the political world altogether. Buchanan lived a very private life in his post-presidency and was basically never seen again publicly. He wrote a book called Administration on the Eve of Rebellion, in which Buchanan basically tries to explain what he did, why he did it, and just generally give his point of view. Practically no one read it. After this, Buchanan just went back to his private life, his private lifestyle, and stayed there. He died on June 1st, 1868, of respiratory failure. I'd like to thank you all for watching this video all the way through. It means a great deal. I'd also like to say that my last video was more successful than any I have ever made before. Now, I made that video in a certain way, and I made it so that it's a video I'd actually watch. I put a lot of effort into my old videos, and they're alright, but I just wouldn't watch them, not in my free time and not by my own choice. I'm going to be making videos from now on covering subjects I find genuine interest in, and I'm going to be doing my best to edit them and narrate them so that they are enjoyable and more, watchable. Maybe following up that video with another video about what boring old guys did in their retirement isn't the best idea. Anyhow, part 2 of this video will probably be coming out either next week or the week after. Before I get go, I'd also like to thank the University of Virginia's Miller Center, which has a series of articles on every president's post-presidency and was a great resource. Goodbye.